The Charles Stanley Institute for Christian Living presents the C.S. Lewis Lecture Series.
Clive Staples Lewis, commonly referred to as C.S. Lewis, and known to his friends and
I am honored to be here, but I also stand on the shoulders of a lot of giants. People like Walter Hooper, Clyde Kilby, Bruce Edwards, others who have written and whom I have borrowed from very liberally at times. But most of all, C.S. Lewis, and he is the one that we are going to study. Now, C.S. Lewis opens one of his Narnian chronicles, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, with a boy that he introduces, and he says, "There was a boy whose name was Eustace Clarence Scrubbs, and he almost deserved it." This was a name that no boy wanted to carry around. And so C.S. Lewis may have viewed his own birth name, Clive Staples Lewis, in a similar way. From his earliest years, however, he chose to be called Jack, or Jaxie, after a little dog that had died. His father, Albert Lewis, was a barrister, sentimental, passionate, and rhetorical, larger than life, this large Irish lawyer. His mother, Flora, came from more sensible and cheerful stock. She was the daughter of an Anglican priest who would be so moved by the Christian message that he would weep during his own sermons. He was also blessed with a remarkably friendly older brother, Warren, who was to be a lifelong friend and companion. The boys spent a considerable amount of time indoors at Little Lee in Northern Ireland, due mostly to the wet weather, gazing from their nursery windows at the distant Castlereagh Hills, or what they called the Green Hills. It was a childhood packed with reading books, drawing imaginary countries populated with talking animals, good food, and wonderful trips to the seashore by rail. But one day his brother Worry brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers, as if to make a toy garden or a toy forest. It ushered Lewis into an impression of beauty and imagination that was something so cool and dewy, fresh, exuberant. More than mechanical toys or artificial games or television, these invasions of the natural world would stir his little soul. Now, to this general happiness, Lewis recounted one exception: the terror of certain night dreams. It is a very common trouble at that age, he wrote, yet it seems to me so odd that children who are so petted and guarded should so often have a window opening on what is hardly less than hell. My bad dreams were of two kinds, those about specters and spirits, and those about insects. The second were, beyond comparison, the worse. To this day, I would rather meet a ghost than a tarantula. The cause, he said, of my insect phobia was fairly simple. In one of his nursery books, there was a detestable picture of a midget child, a sort of kind of Tom Thumb, who stood on a toadstool and was threatened by a stag beetle very much larger than himself. This was bad enough, Lewis wrote, but there was worse to come. The horns of the beetle were strips of cardboard, separate from the plate and worked on a pivot. By moving a devilish contraption, you could make them open and shut like pincers, and it would come out. And if you're a small boy at night reading such books and you see the insect come out at you, you would remember it the whole evening. Lewis said these pincers would go snip, snip, snap, snap. I can still see them as I write my autobiography. Yet a worse nightmare was to come. In 1908, his mother died of cancer. Having prayed diligently for her, his prayers had been unanswered. He had viewed prayers as a sort of practical magic, a technique rather than a conversation with God. But his experimenting with God did not seem to work. His father's own inconsolable suffering and his wild temper after the death of his wife, and Lewis's sense that perhaps it had been his own fault as a boy, conspired to drive a wedge between Lewis and his father. The one consolation that he did have was that he and Worry drew closer and closer together, two frightened urchins huddled for warmth in a bleak world. It is worth an aside here, too, for many of you who have read The Magician's Nephew, because in the book you remember Diggory is sent on a quest to retrieve a magical apple that will cure his mother and keep her alive. And so while his mother is dying, he is tempted to steal the apple for her healing, but he resists with much grief. And so Lewis was able to put his autobiography into his children's literature. Aggravating the loss of his mother was his father's decision to send the boys off to a nightmarish boarding school in England, with the latter discovery that the headmaster turned out to be a madman. In fact, he was a certified lunatic put into an asylum several years after Lewis left. He hated the British public school system, or the private schools, which tended to manufacture boys as a certain kind of regimented, priggish, and cheeky products. He satirized the school in The Silver Chair, where Eustace Scrubb and Jill Pole attend the Experiment House, a progressive, psychologically advanced place along the lines of John Dewey. For Lewis, such school was literally hell. It is telling that in his first book that he ever wrote before he became a Christian, called Dimer, the protagonist runs away from school after whacking his teacher in the head and killing him. This is not a gentle student. In his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis wryly observed that such life, however, in a vile boarding school is in one way a good preparation for the Christian life. It teaches one to live by hope or by faith. For at the beginning of each school term, home and holidays are so far removed that it is so hard to realize heaven. But the hope springs that the holidays will soon be here, and so will paradise. I am the product, he once confessed, of long corridors, of empty small rooms, of upstairs indoor silences, of attics explored in solitude, of distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles. Also the product of endless books and books and books. Now, there were three experiences, he said, from my youth that are the primary story of his life. And the story of his life is that he was moved by an experience that he called joy. The first arrived one day when he was standing beside a flowering currant bush on a summer day and was unexpectedly visited by a memory which seemed so ancient, but was of that earlier morning at his old house when his brother had brought that toy garden in. It opened up a longing for him of this world which seemed so remote and so haunting but so beautiful. And it woke up a longing for what he called the blue flower, a vision, a desire for something that would make him rapturously happy. But he didn't know what that was. It was so pleasurable, but it was so ephemeral. Without warning, he had a strong sensation of desire. But before he knew what he desired, the desire itself was gone. The whole glimpse withdrawn, the whole world had turned commonplace again. It had only taken a moment of time, but in that time, everything had changed. The second glimpse he had of this joy came through reading Beatrix Potter, and you all know her as the great author of the Peter Rabbit series. But it was a short story called Squirrel Nutkin, and Squirrel Nutkin unexpectedly lost his tail. But for Lewis, this opened up and delivered a shock and a quake that a little squirrel who loved his tail would lose it. And it would be such a tragedy. And it troubled Lewis to what he could only describe as the idea of autumn, of things falling off, even tails as well as leaves. He tasted an intense desire for this season of leaves falling, of things passing away, of this life not being where we are meant to be. The last glimpse came through the poetry of Longfellow, his saga of King Olaf. And he had been idly turning the pages and attending to the story in a casual, even shallow way, when there came a moment when he read these lines. I heard a voice that cried, Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead. Like a voice from a far northern region, Lewis was uplifted, and taken to a faraway country. He desired, he said, with almost sickening intensity, something that could never be described. Such longing would lead him into Norse mythology. Lewis later would hear the same mournful echoes in the music of Wagner, particularly the Ring of the Nibelung and the death theme in Tristan and Isolde. This experience underlined 3 moments in Lewis's life that he called joy. Now, it is also interesting to note, too, that his book, Surprised by Joy, came out and was published at the same time he met a woman whose name was Joy Davidman. And we will talk more about her when we deal with the Loves. But his colleagues at Oxford teased him about being really surprised by joy. There's a different kind of joy which will come and unsettle his life, as we will see. Lewis argued that joy must be distinguished from both happiness and from pleasure. Joy, in this sense, has one characteristic and one only in common with them: the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. Apart from that, he suggests, it is closer to a pang of grief, a stab of yearning that nothing in this world can ever satisfy, including the best of human relations and the best of human loves. It is a stirring, painful hint of our lonely journey toward heaven and toward God, a sensation that strikes us as so true and so sad. Yet Lewis doubted whether anyone who has ever tasted it would, if it were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasure in the world. But joy, he says, is never in our power, and pleasure is. He discovered also the cruelty of children when he was going to these schools in the British public education system. And the chapter in his autobiography talking about these schools is called Concentration Camps. So you get a sense of what he felt about it. He detested the kinds of social functions that crammed into his calendar. He resented the schoolboy and the schoolgirl dances, which he was forced to attend as a messy nuisance. They were a source of torment, not only because he was shy, but because he felt forced to pretend to be an adult. He wrote that added to this was the discomfort of one's little Eton suit and a stiff shirt with a stiff collar, the aching feet and the burning head, and the mere weariness of having to be kept up so many hours after one's usual bedtime. Even adults, he fancied, would not find an evening party very suitable or endurable without the attraction of sex and alcohol. And for a small boy who could neither flirt nor drink, how he should be expected to enjoy prancing about on a polished floor till the wee small hours of the morning was beyond his conception. He also developed a very sophisticated vocabulary for a boy so young, which he thought must have sounded very funny coming from the lips of a chubby urchin in an Eton jacket. Lewis was struck by the curious mixture of justice and injustice in our lives. We are usually blamed for our real faults, but not on the right occasions. Now, when he had left his concentration camp of a school and entered the English prep school for 2 years, this was his adolescent phase of life. He had started smoking. He lost whatever rudiments of faith he had. He accepted atheistic thought. He actually tried to become fashionable, modeling himself after a dressy and witty friend whose name was Pogo. He acquired a strong interest in the occult. He started smoking, and he became unchaste. There was a dancing mistress at his school who was the first woman, he wrote, who ever spoke to his blood. Lewis, as a teenager, was presumably arrogant and obnoxious and a brat. And among his peers, he was also a misfit. Lewis was useless at games. The sports that other children took to with delight and energy, he fled. He accepted compulsory games as one of the necessary evils of life, like going to the dentist or doing income tax. He was uninterested in all the gossip of the drama of the Bloods and Tarts, and the floggings and canings were regular experiences. He was also big and clumsy for his age, a great lout of a boy. But worst of all, he confessed, there was my face. Now, I am the kind of person, he said, who gets told, and take that look off your face. Notice, he says once more, the mingled justice and injustice of our lives. No doubt in ill conceit or ill temper, I have often intended to look insolent or truculent about. But people don't seem to notice it on these occasions. On the other hand, the moments when I tried to be very humble are those moments in which I was told, and take that look off your face. He found his solace by going to the library. He valued times alone as a precious gift. As a defense against the unpleasant school situations, Lewis took refuge in his unusual intellect, discovering poets and the romance of mythology, especially Norse and Celtic and Greek gods and goddesses. Here, he began to struggle with religious issues, but he had been only raised on the dry husks of religion, hearing empty social platitudes from the pulpit. He felt superior as far as God was concerned. He maintained that God did not exist, and simultaneously he was very angry with God for not existing. One of the happiest times of his life, however, came when he was 16, when World War I began. He was accepted by a Scottish tutor called the Great Knock, who was an atheist. William Kirkpatrick was the essence of logical discipline. He was the kind of character one meets in real life that no poet would put on the stage because he was too outrageous. He challenged every idle word that Jack would utter, demanding to know on what grounds he was basing his words. For example, when Lewis first got off the train and met the Great Knock, he said, "These woods are wilder than I thought." And the Great Knock said, "Stop. What do you mean by wild? How can you compare it to anything else?" And Lewis realized he had three answers. The first was stop. Basically, you're speaking nonsense. The second was excuse, if he wanted a clarification or a correction. And then finally, I hear you. Lewis said it took a long time to get I hear you. But this was red meat for Lewis, with his rational mind thriving under the stimulation. Herein his habits of debate and argumentation were strengthened for later on in life. Lewis also learned how to enjoy what was given him. To either enjoy works of art or nature for what she is, one must offer total surrender to what is given to one. Shut your mouth, open your eyes and your ears, and take in what is there. Give no thought to anything else that might be around, but focus on the person or the event or the phenomena that is right before you. Thus, like G.K. Chesterton, he would say, find the windiest ridge you can during a nor'easter. Savor the sauciest food on a menu. Endure a monotony of a lecturer who goes on and on and on for all the dullness it can bring you. Fight the fierce battle with Lethe, with the narcotic of sleep coming upon you in the midst of the poppy fields of a lecture, and you will find that you have vanquished an enemy worse than a dragon. So he learned to appreciate the homely and the simple, and he also learned to look on people for what they were. He recognized that everyone is a character in one way, and he looked at the foibles of others with affection. But he said, what that taught me was that I had allowed myself to be irritated by traits in my own father, which in other elderly men I have since regarded as lovable foibles. It is the way we relate to those we love best. Instead of seeing them and enjoying them for what they are, we try to recreate them in our own design. Now, in Lewis's mind, Christianity had been associated mainly with ugly architecture, ugly music, and bad poetry. But what mattered most of all was his deep-seated hatred of authority, his monstrous individualism. No word in his vocabulary expressed deeper hatred than the word interference. Christianity placed at its center the big interferer. All Lewis wanted, he said, was some area, no matter how small, around which I could place barbed wire and a no admittance sign. Around I could say to everyone else, this is my business, leave me alone, mine only, stay out. But God will not allow any little corner to remain unconquered. He wants to check and occupy every hiding place of our hearts. No, Lewis discovered, God interrupts, bothers, disturbs, and invades, just like a spouse. He read voraciously. One particular book he bought at random, purchased at a bookstall, was to undo much of his thinking and turned out to be one of the most single important influences on his life. It was a Christian fantasy by a 19th century Victorian British writer named George MacDonald. It was called Phantastes, and it sent shivers through Lewis's imagination. The night he read it, he said, my imagination is baptized. There is something about holiness in this book which has grabbed me and shaken me. On his 19th birthday, Lewis was conscripted and drafted onto the front lines, the trenches in France. Several things happened here. First, he captured a whole company of German soldiers who just happened to come out of the woods with their hands up. Second, he made a friendship with a young man named Paddy Moore, and both of them vowed to take care of the other person's parent if either one of them died. And Paddy would die, and he would have to take care of his mother, Mrs. Moore. Finally, he contracted trench fever, and in a brief hospital rest, he read and was charmed by the great Roman Catholic journalist G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton burst into Lewis's life like a giant firecracker. In reading Chesterton, he found, like in reading MacDonald, he did not know what he was getting into, and he discovered that a young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. Bibles laid open, millions of surprises, as George Herbert says, fine nets and stratagems by God. God is, if I may say it, wrote Lewis, very unscrupulous. He sneaks into our lives in ways that we don't realize. All the books he had beginning to read were turning against him. Chesterton led the conspiracy with howls of laughter, joy, common sense, and a disordered mop of curly hair and his sheer gigantic size. In these books, Lewis also tasted joy again and again. Yet the stabs of joy reminded him, you want something other, something outside, something beyond yourself, not you or any state of you. It was a road out of himself, away from the place where we all choose to stay and hide and be comfortable. What Lewis liked about experience was that it was an honest thing, that you may take some honest turns, but experience, if you keep your eyes open and your ears open, you will not be allowed to go very far without being warned. Warning signs will appear in your experience. You may have deceived yourself for a while, but experience is not trying to deceive you. Lewis wished to remain a materialist and not believe in the supernatural. But he said every man who is afraid of ghosts will have a reason to wish to be a materialist, because that creed promises to exclude the boogeyman. But finally, an alarming event interrupted Lewis's early in 1926. He sat in his dorm rooms, and the hardest-boiled of all the atheists he ever knew sat in the room with him on the other side. And he was reading, and he remarked about the historical evidence for the Gospels. He said, this is surprisingly good. Rum thing. All this stuff about the dying gods and coming back to life, rum thing. It looks like it actually happened once. To understand the shattering impact of this, Lewis wrote, you would have to know that man. If he, the cynic of the cynics, the toughest of the toughs, were not, as I put it, safe, where could I turn? Was there no escape? Lewis couldn't escape. People who are naturally religious, he wrote, find difficulty in understanding the horror of such a revelation. Amiable agnostics will talk about man's search for God. To me, as I was then, they might as well have talked about the mouse looking for the cat. Yet God had invaded his life, and the demand was simply, give me your all. He wrote in his autobiography, you must picture me alone in my room in Magdalen College, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of the one whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had come upon me at last. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in, admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most depressed, dejected, and reluctant convert in all of England. Divine love opened the high gates to a prodigal who was brought into the kingdom kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes every which way for a chance of escape. This was God invading C.S. Lewis's world. Now he had become a theist, but not yet a Christian. Yet it was inevitable. Each step drew him closer to the Christian faith. God had never wanted God too close, yet his reluctance offered no grounds for evading the hard truth. Still, he debated with Christian colleagues in Oxford, his friends, and one of his older friends, he wrote about something he couldn't understand, how the life and the death of someone who lived 2,000 years ago could help us here and now, except so far as his example might be a good example. But Stephen Hart tells the story On a warm September night in 1931, 3 men went for an after-dinner walk on the grounds of Magdalen College, part of Oxford University. And if you've ever been there to Addison Walk in the back, the deers roam, and it's just a beautiful, serene, rustic area. They were walking along this beautiful tree-shaped path along the River Cherwell and got into an argument about myth, about gods that die and come back to life. There is Balder and Adonis, Bacchus, the corn god that dies every year and comes back every spring. All of these stories of the dying and the living, resurrecting God is in all of these religions. And so they were arguing about these things. And they got into an argument that lasted until the wee hours of the morning and left a lasting impact on world literature. At the time, only one of the 3 men had any kind of reputation. His name was Henry Victor Dyson, a bon vivant who had shared tables and bandied words with T.E. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, and Bertrand Russell. His 2 companions were little-known Oxford academics with a shared taste for Icelandic sagas. In fact, they had a group called the Coalbiters. The Coalbiters was an Icelandic group of people who would come in close to the fire, and they would be so close to the fire that they would be biting the coal. So they were the Coalbiters who would stay in the warmth there. They were also interested in Anglo-Saxon verse and the austere cultural mystique of the North. But few people remember Dyson today, while millions celebrate the names of his 2 companions that you all know, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Yet the works that made their reputations, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, were profoundly shaped by that one night and that argument and the bond it cemented among them. It's possible that Tolkien's Middle-earth would have remained entirely a private obsession, and quite likely that Lewis would have never found the gateway to Narnia. But the men were walking along when they were suddenly interrupted by a rush of wind, which came so suddenly on that warm, still evening and sent so many leaves pattering down the path that we thought it was raining. We all held our breath. In fact, the word for wind and breath, spirit, all come from ancient words. The Hebrew, ruach, the Greek, pneuma, the Latin, spiritus. All of these ideas of wind and breath came upon them. And on that fateful night, 1931, Lewis was in the midst of a fretful return to the religious faith. It remained for Dyson, an Anglican, and Tolkien, a devout Roman Catholic, to push him over the threshold, and though it literally took all night, he became a Christian. Lewis, in fact, as you may know, borrowed Tolkien for his protagonist in That Hideous Strength and the Pelandra science fiction series. The hero is a man named Ransom. He's a philologist, much like Tolkien was. And Tolkien was, for Lewis, a ransom. As they marched back and forth along Addison Walk, Tolkien argued for the literal and the mythological truth of the resurrection. The key moment came when Lewis realized that he believed in myth and all the other myths, but here was a myth that had actually historically happened. This was a myth that had become an historical fact. And so the 2 worlds of the rational mind and the imagination were brought together. 2 weeks later, Lewis told a friend that he had fully embraced Christianity. My long night talk with Dyson and Tolkien, he wrote, had a good deal to do with it. He wrote in his autobiography that the moment happened, he said, when I was riding in the sidecar of a motorcycle to the Whipsnade Zoo. On the way, I did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God, but by the time we reached the zoo, I did. The second half of his life, when he became a Christian at 32, was a quiet and delightful and easy life. After his conversion, his life proceeded more successfully and monotonously for another 23 years, and then at 55 closed with a special 9-year chapter of love and passion and joy and loss. His main pleasures during these last days of being a tutor, a lecturer, and then becoming a don at Magdalen College in Oxford in the autumn of 1924. He would take long walks in the country and sit around the fire and in pubs with his merry, masculine friends, and the Eagle and Child pub, the Bird and the Baby, with this hearty group of friends. It was a tiny counterculture in the midst of Oxford, and they would talk a roaring cataract of nonsense, poetry, theology, metaphysics over beer, hard cider, and their pipes. Here is where Tolkien would write Lord of the Rings and Lewis the Narnian Chronicles. Charles Williams would write his great supernatural thrillers. Now, the long walks had stemmed from habits during World War I when groups like the Ramblers Association would opt for walking over driving anywhere they could. And in fact, if you've read Narnia or Lord of the Rings, what are people doing all the time but walking and hiking? Lord of the Rings is one grand walk of friends trekking from the Shire to Mordor. Now, certain facts about him kind of pop up that are quite novel. He was addicted to tea and found that being served tea in bed the first thing in the morning was one of life's greatest pleasures. He also slept with about a dozen blankets as he liked the heaviness. He loved pubs and he occasionally drank whiskey, but he also prayed every morning, usually on the move, often in his garden. And there's a story about Bob Jones, the great fundamentalist, who went over and visited Lewis. And in his encounter with Lewis, he came back and he said, "The man smokes, the man drinks, but that man is a Christian." When at 35, he published his first book of prose, Pilgrim's Progress, it was kind of an adventure safari of his own spiritual pilgrimage. And it starts off when he is rejecting the landlord because he sees him as too legalistic. And he goes on this long trip and he meets Freudians and Marxists and everyone else that was part of the university faculty of those days. And as he makes his way back to the landlord, he rediscovers that the landlord is more like a father than someone who is laying down the law. In 1938, he brings forth a book called The Allegory of Love. It is a literary study of courtly love, of medieval literature, and it secured his place as a fine scholar in the academy. In spite of his inability to pass math exams, he still found an appointment at Oxford. It was made possible because there was a waiver that was given to men who had fought in the war. Thus, he was able to join a very odd faculty that included a person and a character like William Spooner of New College, who misplaced consonants at the beginning of words, so that when he referred to the dear Queen, he said the queer dean. Or he complained that his students had hissed his mystery lectures, or that certain students had tasted a whole worm, wasted a whole term. His Spoonerisms would become legend. Lewis would meet a whole company of eccentric characters and became one himself, people with whom he could argue and laugh. He himself would wear an old tweed coat and looming as a large and hearty man with a ruddy complexion. He would remind many of his students of a local grocer or butcher with his giant laughing red face. In fact, Lewis's booming voice, rum, rum, would become the model in Lord of the Rings for Treebeard. Treebeard is C.S. Lewis planted in the Shire. In 1942, he was commissioned to do a series of radio talks for the British Broadcasting Channel on what Christians believe, a contribution which was to make his voice the second most recognizable in a beleaguered Britain during the bombing of London. He offered messages of hope in the darkness of war. In 1942, he would turn out a book that brought him to international fame and put him on the cover of Time magazine, The Screwtape Letters. With its success, he became a celebrity, a man who could talk theology without putting on a long face or being dull. During the war, he lived at a place called the Kilns, this kind of baking house, with two lunatic housemaids, Warney, his brother, who was drunk most of the time, and Minto. They took in 4 schoolgirls during the bombing of London who had been evacuated. In June 1943, there was one in particular, a 16-year-old June Fluitt, who was a devout Roman Catholic and aspiring actress, and she was considered a saint. Lewis thought, this woman knows how to serve without complaining about anything, and a woman of joy. She was in the house for about a year until she discovered that Jack was the author, C.S. Lewis. His lectures were as popular as his writings. In fact, his work as a popularizer and translator earned him sneers and complaints from his academic colleagues. He was accused of luring readers down the garden path of Christian orthodoxy. Oxford even denied Lewis a professorship because his popular writings on the Christian faith were deemed unseemly. So he moved to a more distinguished chair, a professorship of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, referring to his move from Oxford as being in that prior dark land which I have been rescued from. His life was marked not only by good humor, but by cheerful generosity as well. He gave dutifully to the demanding Mrs. Moore, who lived with him and Warnie until she died in 1951. He gave away enormous sums of money, giving at least 2/3 of his royalties to people in need who just asked, "Oh, if we had only known." He might have given away more than that if his friend and lawyer had not organized his financial affairs. Unselfishly, he also gave of his time and thought, particularly in letter writing. His hand had grown rheumatic over time, but he never failed to answer every letter personally, convinced of the importance of every human soul who contacted him, even children. And there are books of collections of his letters to children, which is full of sensitivity and wisdom and play. By the early 1950s, Lewis was ensconced in teaching, tutoring, and writing, and described as a middle-aged bachelor professor who lives a mildly humdrum life. When Time magazine interviewed him, he said, "I like monotony. Monotony is good." But then an unexpected event interrupted and disrupted his easy existence. A letter from a Brooklyn ex-communist, Jewish, atheist divorcee invaded his life and started a friendship that was to bring joy, romance, grief, and wisdom into his ordinary life. The last 9 years of his life rivaled the first 9 in happiness and pain. Their relationship of Joy Davidman and Lewis became the script for 2 films, one from the BBC and the other from Hollywood, starring Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger, called Shadowlands. Lewis once remarked that he preferred tree-like people to flower-like people, the staunch and naughty and storm-enduring kind of people to the frilly and the fragrant and the easily withered. Joy was a tree-like companion. She had a mouth like a sailor, or anyone that likes the Yankees. He first married her secretly to keep her in Britain. But then, after marrying her in a civil ceremony, and she stayed with her 2 boys, she was struck as well by cancer. Everything changed. In the spring of 1957, a priest married the 2 of them in a Christian ceremony at her bedside in a hospital where she lay dying of cancer. However, the priest decided to also pray for her healing, and he laid hands on her and prayed. And apparently in response to this prayer and the laying on of hands, she was healed. They had 3 more extremely happy years together at the Kilns, even taking honeymoons to Ireland and to the glittering Isles of Greece. This is something that the movies do not point out, this kind of new life that Joy had after this prayer of healing. She died in the summer of 1960 at 45 years old. Lewis's own health had deteriorated these same years. His own medical records were of no more interest to him than the facts of his financial affairs. An enlarged prostate gland caused damage to his kidneys and led to a painful and crippling osteoporosis. It was a grim business, even as he kept up his writings and letters and afternoon tea. In one of his last letters, Lewis commented about his impending death. "It's all rather fun, you know. Solemn fun, isn't it? The holidays are almost here." He died on November 22nd, 1963, at home in his room. Within an hour, John F. Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas, and Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, would pass on to his own world. His achievements have endured remarkably well. As Peter Kreeft asks, who has made Christianity more morally compelling, more imaginatively moving, and more rationally convincing in this century? But what, in conclusion, of Joy? And I read from the last page of his autobiography. For that, after all, Joy, is what this story has been mainly about. To tell you the truth, the subject has lost nearly all interest for me since I became a Christian. I cannot indeed complain, like Wordsworth, that the visionary gleam has passed. I believe, if the thing worth recording, that the old stab, the old bittersweet experience has come to me as often and as sharply since my conversion as at any time of my life whatsoever. But I know now that the experience considered as a state of my own mind, had never the kind of importance I once gave it. It was valuable only as a pointer to something other and outer. While that other was in doubt, the pointer naturally loomed large in my thoughts. The signpost was important. In the woods, he who first sees a signpost cries, "Look!" and the whole party gathers around it and stares. But when we have found the road and we are passing signposts every few miles, we shall not stop and stare. They will encourage us, and we shall be grateful for the authority that set them up. But we shall not stop and stare at the signpost, or not much. Not on this road, though their pillars are made of silver and their lettering of gold. We would be at Jerusalem. Not, of course, he says, that I don't often catch myself stopping to stare at roadside objects of even less importance. But the signposts were no longer important. The joy had been a pointer, and now he has moved on. Looking back on his early years, Lewis observed, I feel the whole of one's youth to be immensely important and even of immense length. The gradual reading of one's own life, seeing a pattern emerge, is a great illumination of our age. And so I hope that C.S. Lewis has been a signpost for us, that we look at his life and not just look at it, but we look through it and see him as a sign to a greater person. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Part 1, The Life of C.S. Lewis, brought to you by the Charles Stanley Institute for Christian Living.